All right, cool. So yeah, so I've now completed all the sections, at least for study groups. I know more or less people are still going through those sections and stuff like that. And I'll kind of repeat it just because it's on the recording. My suggestion is like really focusing on like the topics 4, 5, 6, like really up to 6 is really what you need to do the project. Section 7, 8, 9, 10 are also important, but definitely are not necessary for the project. And in reality, there's going to be some sections that maybe you kind of have to go through a little bit more, or like you haven't completed like the little mini projects. And I would say, don't worry too much about that. Don't completely ignore it and say, oh, I didn't get to it, so I'll just never touch them again. Definitely kind of put those on your radar as like extra practice. But from kind of like starting next week, I'd say you should kind of all be focused just in the project, not trying to also complete sections. Okay. So today we're going to kind of go through some details of the project. So I'm going to share my screen. And
Victor,
yeah.
now 7 is sequel, right? I
Yes.
thought you were saying this is a sequel database. What the?
Yeah. So there's actually a slight change from before. So I'll go over that today.
Okay.
So yeah, let me share my screen. And yeah, great point out. I might have said some things in the past too that actually aren't true. So if there is something I say and you're like, wait, didn't you say something different? Like, you guys let me know and I'll correct myself either from the past or my present self is wrong. Someone's wrong. Past Victor or present Victor is wrong. So cool. All right, I'm just adjusting my window so I can see you all. All right, cool. So you guys are seeing more than you normally would. But under phase 1 is what we're going over. And so let me go into student view because I believe that's the way you guys would see things. Let's let that load. Okay, so you guys have seen like all the topics and stuff like this. So you should see a new section down here called Milestones. Does anyone notice that on like the phase underneath the appendices? Yeah, cool. So that's actually where the project material is going to live here. And so I'm actually going to just click on this first one here. And you see a little bit, this is actually the GitHub repo, right? So you could open up the GitHub repo and all that stuff. And it gives you a lot of details about like the actual project. And to kind of summarize, this is like the main thing that like, this is kind of like the scenario that you're put in and the kind of like the basis of your project. And so anyone who's read it already like kind of knows, but I'm just kind of read it here since, some people might not have gotten the full details. Basically, Microsoft is going to be, it's kind of, this is the scenario, is that Microsoft is looking at all these other companies making, original content, like Apple TV and all these different things. And so they decided, it's like, you know what, we want to get into the game of like movie business too. And so they actually want to create a new movie studio. But, the idea is like, they're not really sure what movies to start creating and stuff like that, like what would make the most sense. So you are charged with exploring what types of films are currently doing the best at the box office. You must then translate those findings. So this is the big important part. You must translate those findings into actionable insights. To emphasize what actionable means, it means something that Microsoft can do. Like, say, what should Microsoft do? That's kind of like the idea of saying, based on what I've explored and what I've seen, this is what I recommend you doing. Okay. To the head of Microsoft's new movie studio so they can help decide what films to create. So a couple things in here, right? Is that we say like doing the best at the box office, right? And then we're really saying like these are actually slightly different ideas. So like what might happen is that this is kind of a great scenario for the first project is a stakeholder might say, oh, we want to see what the best movies are doing at the box office. So we can create movies ourselves. You as a data scientist do have to translate a little bit of that because the best movies at the like in the box office right now might be different from the films that they should create. Does that make sense? Like those don't necessarily equate to the same thing, but there are factors, right? It's like, oh, what is doing really well? And then also what should we create? Does that make sense to people? Okay. And that's the kind of that interpretation and like really the translation. Because if you just wanted to know what the best were doing in the box office, that could be like a simple, like, oh, let me just find the ones that are producing the most money. But obviously we're going to have a little more exploration in that. So that's the overall problem. Does anyone have any questions on like that scenario? No, nothing pops in mind. Okay, cool. If things do pop up, this is where like you guys ask questions either here or like on Slack and all that stuff.
I did have a
ahead.
question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're kind of like saying like this is happening now, but like just the way the movie theaters and everything is, and I looked at some of the data like for the year like 2020, a lot of them just the numbers are missing because they didn't get released in the theater.
Mm-hmm.
So are we just to assume that the like that this is happening in like February of 2020.
Right, saying like a place before COVID and quarantine and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is the funny thing is like this movie project kind of has changed gears. I will say is that by default, I would say, yeah, think of it like the February of 2020, you know, like when people were still going to movie theaters and movie theaters weren't suffering and stuff like this. You can think of it in that way. If you want, like, you can take this project in a slightly different direction and say, no, let me think about it as in 2021 during this time where movie theaters are not open. And Microsoft is looking to basically open up, you know, make new movies and stuff like that, what that would look like. Note that's going to change on how you view the data, and you might even want to include other data on what I'm going to show you guys as provided. But that is an option. But by default, if you're like, well, that seems like a lot, or like I'm not really sure how to approach this, you can approach this as if it's February 2020, you know, before the whole pandemic COVID stuff happened. Does that make sense? Cool. Thank you, Seth. Yeah, good good thing to point out, because this is definitely a little different from, I'll tell you, my other cohorts have had this problem or done this project. All right, so there is some data that's already provided. So I'm just going to show you guys, I'm going to go move actually to the GitHub repo. So you guys know how to find the GitHub repo from these lessons, right? Like I think I showed you guys already. Hopefully you guys all understand. It's this little button here. And so if you look at this, right, we're talking about the data set right here. There's actually a folder right here called zip data. And that's actually where we provide you with CSVs and it looks like a few TSVs as well of data. So you'll have to pull this data. You'll have to load this data, or you can use this data. So we provided that data already to kind of like allow you to like skip over most of the data acquisition step, which can take a long time, right? If you're trying to find the right stuff. Now you saw all those different files. I think there's something about like almost 10 different like data files. You decide what makes the most sense for what questions you want to ask and want to investigate. Okay, so don't feel like you have to use all of it. And in fact, you might even use like other like data. For example, you might do a little bit of scraping. You might do some API calls if you find like an API that can get information that you want that's relevant to you. But note that you can always go back to, like, don't feel like you have to do those things. In fact, I usually suggest is like, see what data you already are provided. You can kind of imagine, is this data that's already provided to you by Microsoft saying, oh, here's the data we already collected, like starting off with. But you might also say, oh, you know, well, I want to investigate this. Is there a quick way I can look into this data set, or sorry, this other data set, and then combine it with the data I have? Does that make sense to people? Okay, cool. So yeah, but I would say don't try to focus on doing these extra things first. See what data you have first, and then if you like I think I could answer this other question if I had this data, and then if you feel up to it, you know, maybe take a little bit of time to see if that data is quickly available and whether it's accessible. And if it is, you know, then say, okay, let me try to do this and supplement your main project. But one trap I do know students do tend to get is that they'll try to focus on getting more data, and then like they go through the half of their project and they're like, oh, cool, I got all my new data, but I haven't started even exploring the original data and doing anything. So don't fall into that trap, right? So that's kind of giving you guys a little warning. All right. So the main stuff, like actual like assessment, like what does it look like? There are three things that you really need, and really they're kind of like combined. They're really two things. So one is basically you need a GitHub repository. So you need a GitHub repo to host your project. And I kind of already mentioned this a little bit. Part of the reason why you want a GitHub repo is not just for our sake here at Flatiron and for me to see your code, but also for other people to see, oh, look, this person was working on a project and actually have something to show for it. So we'll talk about throughout the week about how to form your GitHub repo to make it nice and neat and presentable for someone who does come across your project. Okay, Saman, yeah.
For this repo, I guess we have to create this from the scratch, not just like forking the whatever it is you have right now, right?
Yeah, so I would suggest probably starting from scratch versus forking. Like I think the curriculum even suggests like, oh, you could fork this repo. I don't suggest it because it's kind of funky, because then you got to remove a bunch of files or rename them and do weird things. I think it's a better idea to just create a new repo from scratch and then load in the data that you need or things that are relevant to what you want to do. Yeah, makes sense. Cool. And we'll go over that too. So if not today, it'll definitely be Friday. So cool. So you need a GitHub repo to basically host all your stuff. And then you need a Jupyter notebook, right? So you're at least a Jupyter notebook. Some people like to like split up their Jupyter notebooks, but I would say I am someone who tends to use one big Jupyter notebook, but I document and like segment my Jupyter notebook into different sections, kind of like I've already been doing with all like our study groups, right? You saw my notebooks, how they're kind of like sections and subsections, and we'll talk about like how you can form those and how to structure. So your Jupyter notebook is really about like communicating like your investigation, your exploration as a data scientist. So we'll kind of talk a little bit what that means. But the main idea there is basically you are documenting, loading in the data, exploring, answering questions in there. So it's not just going to be code, but it's also going to be a mix of like your Markdown cells, the things that are not code, right? Explaining what you're seeing and stuff like that. And then ultimately in this project, basically coming up to your conclusions. And so you can think of your Jupyter notebook as more the technical side, and that you're writing it not for like someone who's not a data scientist, those kind of stakeholders. Instead, you're writing it to almost like other data scientists who might be looking at your notebook. So that's the kind of like feel that you should go towards. And there's some extra things that, you know, key points, you can read these things a little bit, what's going on. A big thing you want to make sure to focus on is think about communicating. Like your code, like your Jupyter notebook should be something that is readable and presentable and also reproducible. So like, for example, sometimes people will have like commented out code still in their Jupyter notebook. Like that's okay, that's a little bit here and there, but like I shouldn't see huge swaths of like commented out code, because then it's like not really relevant to what you were doing. So you probably want that deleted. Like you want to make things clear, so if someone reads it from the top to the bottom, understanding basically like essentially is trying to understand your process. And we'll talk about what that is. I call it like a data story. Like a data narrative. Like you're saying like, oh, as a scientist, I took the data, I load the data. These are the things I saw. These are the things like, oh, this is really interesting. So I explored it in this way and I concluded this thing. That's kind of the idea of what you're doing when your notebook. Does that make sense? Generally, any questions on that? I know I went through it really quickly. We'll go into more detail, I promise. Okay. So that's kind of like the idea of your Jupyter notebook. You can read again, like all these sections. And then the other part is going to be the non-technical presentation. So this non-technical presentation is actually going to be done. We're actually going to do this as a group. So I think the reason why I've actually done it in the past where I will individually like assess you still. But I used to do like the non-technical presentation and the Jupyter notebook together individually, like, you know, would be me and then, you know, whoever the student is, and we kind of go through it together. I think it's beneficial for us to kind of do it as a group, like a presentation. So one day we'll reserve a time and we'll basically take turns presenting our findings. And I think that's really nice because you can see one, as other ways people kind of came to different conclusions, or maybe the same conclusion, but in different ways. And then two, is that it gives us practice a little bit talking, like, you know, you can kind of feel a little bit like a little bit of a crowd, but sometimes, I don't know how people feel about presentations. Usually people are on the side of like, I'm not a huge fan of presentations, but it is something it is a skill that takes practice and stuff like that. And we'll talk about how to go through the stuff. But your presentation really should be about, like, first of all, should be focusing towards non-technical, meaning non-data scientist audience. So that means you're saying, okay, here's my evidence, and this is what I think you should do with it. But you wouldn't want to say something like, you know, like, for example, you might not present like, oh, the standard deviation of, you know, these values or blah, 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 blah. Like that might be too technical for that level. We'll talk about what that looks like too. But you want to make sure your information is coming across as being like, oh, these are the things I want you to do. And this presentation should really only be about 5 minutes. Like at the shortest, like maybe 4 minutes. And then at the longest, it should be like I mean, I'm hesitant to say how long it should be, but like at the after 10 minutes, like that's way too long. And I might even, like, for the record, I might have to cut people off if it goes past 10 minutes. And that's partly because like you want to be concise, and different presentations, you'll have different presentations in your life. Some of them, they ask for an hour-long presentation. It's going to be a very, very different presentation than someone saying, hey, we want you to come in and give a 5-minute spiel of what you found. You know, like that's going to be like, you need to really think about what are the important things that you want to emphasize. So I think it's a really great like opportunity, because I don't know if anyone's ever had really like a real like 5-minute presentation, like either in school or in like their job life and stuff like that. It's definitely a skill that you have to learn.
Longer than, yeah, that's for sure. Get
Yeah,
your point
Clark,
across.
yeah.
No, I'm just saying to get your point across quickly is
Yeah, exactly. And it's
a
important.
real
So
art.
yeah, it definitely is an art. So don't feel like you have to be perfect. We'll talk a little bit of some strategies and stuff that will work. So know that these are the two main things: the Jupyter Notebook, which I call it the technical piece, and then the non-technical, and that's the presentation. These two things will be in your GitHub. So your non-technical presentation should be at least a PDF of that presentation included in there. Okay, cool. Makes sense to everyone? And just remember, that's all you really have to turn in for this project. The assessment, like I said, is that we'll come together and do like a non-technical presentation as a group. And then, I usually try to give you guys feedback. So I'll kind of say like, oh, things I noticed. And of course, we can talk about as a group as well. And then the Jupyter Notebook, the technical side, will actually have like a one-on-one, just you and me. And I'll look over you'll go through your code, kind of like your the way I explain it is like you're talking to another data scientist or like a data science manager, and you're just basically getting that person up to speed of like what you've done and what you found. And that will be like about a 30-minute, kind of like a back and forth. It's a lot more informal than like having a technical presentation. So that's what it looks at. Ben, I saw you raised your hand.
You had said that the Jupyter Notebook shouldn't be commented. Do you mind like just elaborating a little on that?
Yeah, what I mean is like you can have comments in your Jupyter Notebook, but like you shouldn't have like huge amounts of code that you tried out and then like, oh, that didn't work out, and just comment it out and then just left it there. Like you want it to look a little like clean. Like it doesn't have to be pristine, but it shouldn't be like a mess where I have to like dig through and understand exactly what's going on. It should be relatively readable.
Thank you.
No problem. All right. So yeah, just need to read this this repo, right? The data, like I said, is in this folder here. So we'll talk about like maybe how to set up your GitHub repo for your own GitHub repo to include this data. But that's it. That's kind of the idea of the phase 1 project. Any questions, like really high level questions? We're going to go into some more details about this project. But any questions that kind of come to mind right now after going off of that? Cool. All right. All right, hopefully I'm feeling all right. Like nothing, don't feel too nervous now. So I'm gonna go through some more specific details on like our timeline and like kind of like some advice as well. So that'll probably take the rest of, well, most of the time for the rest of the study group. And then we'll have time open for like questions, and we'll probably have time to start doing like building people's GitHub repos and show you like what that process looks like. Excuse me. Okay, so timeline, right? So it technically, I say starts now. This is actually based off an older notebook I made, but it's technically like starts next week, but you can think of like we're starting the project now. So like any questions now, feel free to talk about the project. Like don't feel like you have to hold things back. So just know that next week are study groups. Even though they're study groups, they're going to be closer to office hours. I might have a couple things, especially if people are asking a lot of questions. I might have a couple study groups that are focused on a specific aspect, but they're going to be more open to like any one question, a lot more free form than like my normal, like kind of like planned out lessons and stuff like that. So just kind of know that structure is going to be different. And of course, I'll try, I typically don't record office hours, as you guys probably noticed. But if there is something really relevant, like for example, people are asking like, oh, like, how do I do this on GitHub? And I'm like, oh, this is actually really important. I might record that session and then add that into the playlist. So just kind of know that if you want to attend, like if you want to like attend office hours and see what other people are talking about, you probably should attend it versus like looking at the recording, because it's not guaranteed it'll be recorded. Okay. The assessments will actually start February 8th. So I should have this on the cohort calendar. I don't think I actually have this on the calendar right now, but it's useful for us to in the student view. Hold on, I gotta hop in here. There we go. So yeah, we can know the cohort calendar. You'll notice that next week it'll say project week, right? So that's kind of like all focused on project week. And then you'll see here, I don't have it on here, we'll actually start doing assessments on February 8th. And those assessments will be one-on-ones with me going over like the Jupyter Notebook, okay? Note that on February 8th, we are starting phase 2. So one suggestion I would do is like, if you're like, try to plan as like getting things done and being ready for your assessment by February 8th or close as possible to February 8th. That way you can start doing you can do your assessment and then just like say, oh, I'm done with my assessment. I don't have to worry about it anymore. and just focus on the new phase 2. Technically, it's not due until February 22nd. The 22nd is like the very, very last day you can do your assessment. And if, for the record, if you can't finish it by the 22nd, then you have to transfer to another cohort to repeat the phase. Okay. But if you look at that, that's actually like after a project week, right? That's actually 1-2 weeks, and then there's like an extra day, right? So like that's actually quite a lot of time. And so like if for some reason you're starting to get closer to that 22nd, like, you know, you'd definitely let me know. It's like, hey, like I'm taking some time here. Like, I want to get this done. But one thing that I do know students tend to do, or not, just naturally happens, they'll kind of keep putting off their assessment, like keep fixing up their project. But at the same time, phase 2 is going on. We'll have 2 weeks of phase 2 by the time that deadline hits. The problem is it's very hard to do the project and learn new material at the same time. So my suggestion is really buckle down, you know, this next week, you know, even like this week, and get as much as you've done with your project. And then hopefully within that very first week, you can start doing the assessment, and then you don't have to worry about it after that. Does that make sense to people? Cool. All right. I'll also put in here, well, this is kind of where I talk about like where to get help and stuff like this, but I'll put in there is that one thing I think students tend to do, maybe it's just because of like traditional schooling, is students will like work on their project, but they don't want to share it at all until like they're done with it. And in this case, I would say don't do that. Like, first of all, you know, share amongst each other, right? I think that's a good actual process. I'm not going to be like, I'm not worried about you cheating off each other, if that makes sense. Like, I'm not like, oh, like, you know, so-and-so did this exactly like this. Like, oh, like, you know, F or whatever. Like, obviously don't literally copy each other, but like, I think you guys can use each other as like resources to help understand what's going on. And then also feel free to like, for example, I literally had students like share their GitHub repos, like, hey, here's my repo. Like, I'm doing this thing. Like, would anyone like to take a look? Feel free to like tag me in there. Just like, hey, Victor, you know, like I've like already done like my project a little bit. Like, do you think you can just kind of quickly look it over? And I'd be happy to look it over before our assessment. And I actually prefer that, because I prefer when you guys come to the assessment, you guys are all set, and I already know exactly like, oh, this, they're like, oh, so-and-so came in here. I know they're going to be set. Like, I don't have to worry about this assessment at all. The ones that scare me are the ones when I don't know it, because they haven't shown me anything. And I'm like, okay, hopefully they got everything they need to. So feel free to reach out. Okay. So don't feel ashamed at all to do that. And then just know like the classic like DS support squad, right? So that's like, for example, if I'm not available, you can always tag DS support squad. There's also a couple of channels on the Slack. I think these are the same channels that are available now. I just want to kind of just cross-referencing, but there are the DS-PC users. This is like if you're Windows, sometimes you come across some weird issues. I think most people kind of figured things out, but that's available. The module Python DS channel. So that's kind of like basic Python and stuff like this. And then the data engineering channel, that's kind of going to be a little more about kind of like doing like the SQL and stuff like this. So you probably want to ask more on this channel, but that also includes other cohorts, not just ours. So just kind of know like that those people are out there too. Okay. And of course, you know, help each other out. Make sense? Not very good? Cool. All right. Any questions so far? Yeah. All right, cool. So, okay. So let's talk about this project a little bit. Like I already mentioned what you should need to do. I highlighted some extra parts, like parts like what you should be thinking, like help them better understand the movie industry, right? So you're really trying to like, they're hiring you to like understand like what to do, right? Versus like they're not telling you, oh, just tell us what the biggest movies are and we're just going to make those. They actually are hiring you to say, hey, we want to hear what your insights are about this. So really think about like exploring like what type of films are doing best at the box office, but that's not the only thing you should look at, right? Like you might want to think like, what does it mean by the best, right? Best can actually, you know, we can just say best being like the highest value, or how much money people brought in, but maybe there's something more to that, right? So you really think about what this looks like. And then actionable insights. I cannot stress this out enough, is that you can do all the exploration you want, but at the end of the day, you have to come back to the company, the stakeholders, and say, hey, this is what I think you should do. And depending on, you know, how you feel comfortable, or maybe even your personality, you might not really feel as comfortable saying like, oh, I think you should do this. Maybe you're like maybe do this kind of thing. Like I really think like as a data scientist, is like if you come back say, hey, this is what I found, and so based on what I found, I think you should do this. like that's kind of how you want to approach presenting this information. So like really saying like, hey, like this is like what I found as a data scientist, and you hired me to do this stuff, and I think this is what you should do. Sometimes students might, like, who are less comfortable with this, will kind of say things like, oh, I found this stuff. And like, that's cool. You found this evidence of like things that happened, but like, what do you tell the stakeholders to do then with that information? And that's where you come in and say, oh, I think you should do X, Y, and Z. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I do have one quick question, if you don't mind. What are some examples of like actual actionable insights, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah.
Is it like an investment kind of perspective, or what's kind of the process or idea?
Yeah, I think in this case, you can literally say like, these are the film genres like I think you should invest in. Like, it can get more complex than this, but like the main thing is like, oh, these are things that I think you should do. In this case, what they're asking you to do, like what they're asking you to do is like see what movies to make. And so you might say, for example, like you found, hey, I think you should make like exclusively romance movies, because it looks like romance movies are like doing super well. Like they're easy to film, like their budgets are super low. Like, you know, this is like the right option to do. And then we see a rise, you know, of romance movies, you know, in this past 2020, and maybe a little bit of like, you know, 2021, people are looking for someone to love because it's been so long, you know, since they had to be in quarantine. I don't know. But like, that's the kind of idea, like you want to say, I think as a data scientist, based on my evidence, that you should be making romance movies. And maybe your actual insights might be a little more complex than that, but that's kind of the idea.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
No problem. Clark, I saw your hand.
Yeah, maybe this is what Eric, I think, is asking the same thing I'm asking. So, but you know, sometimes you'll be a loss leader. I think about where I live. Like, there's a bunch of companies that have storefronts that don't make any money relative to other places, but they want to be there because it's Bethesda, Maryland, and they'll take a loss there. So, are they trying to, you know, Netflix is sort of a loss leader in a lot of regards at first. You know what I mean? So you wouldn't necessarily make the thing that brings in the most profit when you factor out expenses, but you might do something over the top. I mean, what's the motivation on the client side, I guess, is the question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. And this is where, like, obviously, like, this is like a hypothetical situation, right? So like, we don't literally have a person to like ask this question, say, oh, like, hey, let's, like, you know, in reality, you might actually look a little more like what exactly they're wanting and kind of talk with them. In this case, like, you can really think about, like, pretend like you're talking to someone and then you're answering those questions back. So for example, if you say like, oh, like I view maybe Microsoft wants to be more like Netflix and stuff like that, and say these are the kind of like the answers that would come back to me if I were to ask these questions.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
So we can set that up more ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. And
I mean, because if totally, I'm saying I want to just get the most bang for my buck, so I might not want to spend a lot of expenses, you know, and I'm just purely focused on profit. You might go a bunch of small indie type films that cost nothing to make, but give you 100% or 200% return on your money. I mean, so I can, you're telling me I can pick whatever the client would.
Right. Because we don't literally have a client to ask, like you get to be kind of like the other side of the client.
Okay, good. Thank you.
No problem. That's a great question, by the way. Yeah. And this is where like you get to be a little flexible and like you can kind of decide of like how deep you really want to go into this, right? Is like what that client looks like. Cool. All right. Oops, dropped something. So some advice to things to consider, right? So one, like kind of like what Clark was just saying, like put yourself in like the shoes of your stakeholder and like pretend like, you know, like in reality, you probably like if you wanted clarification, you probably would go to your stakeholder and say, hey, like I want to clarify like what is your, you know, motivation on this, you know, like what are you looking for and what are your restrictions, what are your things that you aren't able to do or not willing to do, right? But in this case, like really put yourself as a stakeholder and pretend like you're you know you're gonna pop back an answer to you. So like, what do they want? Like, what do they really want to know? Is the information geared towards them? So like, remember like when you're talking in your non-technical presentations, is that like, are you taught like don't spew out a bunch of statistics necessarily because that might not be really interpretable. I like to tell people is like, when you're talking to someone who's like not a data scientist, which we say non-technical, think of it someone who has like a high school background, right? And so think about yourself like when you like the average person who graduated high school, like how much math do they really know in that sense? And like, you know, some people might know statistics, but there's a lot of people who really wouldn't know much about statistics coming out of high school and stuff like that. So you have to make sure things are understandable. Oh, of course, in reality, like depends on like the situation. If you're talking to a client that's like very, like I would say more tech savvy, right? More in the field. Maybe you're talking to a bunch of statisticians who are not data scientists, but statisticians. You can go into that more detail that you wanted. But really think about who your audience is. And then I cannot emphasize enough those insights, like saying like, okay, you're providing insights which lead to actionable items. Like, hey, I discovered this thing, so I think you should do this. That's really what that insight is. It's like, I discovered this thing, and your actionable insights is, so I think you should do this thing. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. Do the data reflect what you are saying? So this is actually like, this seems really obvious, but sometimes it's hard to like notice this, especially when you kind of come in like thinking like what the data should look like. But really think about like, are the data complete? Like, we are looking at the data, like this data set, but is it including everything that we are assuming it's including, and looking at that? So like, for example, I'll just kind of say is like, does it like, let's say, for example, the data includes like the amount of money made in this year, and you say, oh, 2020 was really, really low. And you're like, wow, 2020 is like, like did really, really poorly. Like obviously probably did really poorly this year, but it might just be that the data is incomplete. For example, maybe they only go up to like, January, and it's like, oh, well, of course, 2020 did worse because we only counted data up to 2020. So really think about like, oh, am I really looking at the full picture here? Note that like, are the differences statistically significant? We haven't gone over like a lot of this yet. We're going to talk about this in phase 2. But think about too, like if you see a small difference, like just in general, if you know statistics, like you kind of go through this, but like you can kind of think of it like, if there's a small difference, is that like a really good, like, it's like, oh, there's just like, let's say it's off by like, I don't know, just say like 0.1 million, like it's like, oh, these movies are like 0.1 million difference. Like, oh, might be a relatively small where maybe they're making like, let's just say like 50 million or something like that. Like 0.1 million, then it's relatively small difference where you wouldn't say necessarily, oh, like this movie is definitely like genre is definitely better because they made 0.1 million, like, $100,000 more, for this genre on average. Does that make sense? Like really think about like, okay, like what is that statistical difference, and make sure you interpret that correctly, right? And then just kind of know like your potential biases, right? Just kind of be aware, like, I think this is just something, a good thing to check in general. Like, I think at this level, you probably would be able to identify saying, oh, like, well, I like superhero movies. So like, I just assume superhero movies are going to do well. So like, that's why you investigate. Like, I think that's kind of obvious for you to like, make sure you check, but for future stuff too, always be aware of like potential biases of what sometimes even the stakeholders are saying. The stakeholders might say, oh, well, we think this is, like, oh, we know this is true already. And you might actually start investigating in that way, and then realize like, what, maybe I should explore a little bit wider than what the stakeholder said. And you realize it's actually something very different. This happens all the time in data science stuff. Like even before data science, it's called data science. There's definitely biases where people get shoehorned in thinking a certain way, and then they find out like, oh, wait, like it's actually it's a much broader story. And I can go into details about a story about that, but like
Victor in real life, that's another great skill, convincing the boss that his idea is wrong. So.
Yes, that's actually a really hard, that's a really hard thing, even when you have a lot of like prestige behind you. That can be tough. Okay, I'm gonna go into quick story time, then I'll kind of go through. Have you guys heard about like the story of like with different pasta sauces? I'm forgetting the name for this person who actually investigated this, was a statistician. So this actually starts off back to like Pepsi, when they were actually making their diet Pepsi and their normal Pepsi. And what they found, like they were trying to figure out like what was like the amount of aspartame, which is gonna like make things like, a little bit sweet, but if you put too much aspartame, it gets really sweet. And if you put not enough, it gets kind of bitter. They're kind of figuring out like how much aspartame they should put in like soda. And so they're just trying to basically like, what do the people prefer? And the idea is like, oh, you have like, the idea is like, there is some perfect amount that most people will want. Think of like we haven't talked about bell curves, but if you think of like a normal bell curve and stuff like this, like most people like this amount. Some people like a smaller amount, but some people like maybe, and like some people like a higher amount, but most people like this certain amount. They were looking for that certain amount. And when they do the data, they actually find is that it's not true. Turns out there's actually people who really prefer a lot of aspartame and people who really prefer like, a lot less aspartame. We basically had a bimodal distribution. And the funny thing is like the story goes that like, I forget the name. I have to look up this person, like a statistician, because they did a whole bunch of really interesting things after this. But they kind of came up to the company and said, hey, like, we're looking for one individual value, but that value doesn't actually exist. We're finding in our data that there's actually two separate values. And unfortunately for that statistician, the company said, nah, like that's we're not going to deal with it. Like, no, like you're wrong. Like they couldn't be convinced. The funny thing is that I believe it was, oh my gosh, it was a pasta sauce company. And I want to say ragu, but it might not be ragu. That same statistician kind of came up with this like, hey, maybe people aren't like single value. Maybe there needs to be like multiple, like there's more bimodal kind of choices. And basically came up with this to the pasta company. I want to say it's ragu. See, this is where like the story, like me kind of passing on might be wrong, right? But the idea is still there. And they actually went to the company and said, hey, we actually noticed that some people like their salsa or their pasta sauce chunky. Some people like their pasta sauce smooth. And some people like their pasta sauce spicy. And it's like, but the thing is that there aren't any spicy pasta sauce out there. And so like, you should make this pasta sauce. And the pasta sauce company is like, yeah, like, oh yeah, absolutely. And their sales like took off because they were the only one making that kind of pasta sauce that people didn't know that like they wanted that thing. And it wasn't until they found like in their data of actual experimenting and stuff like that they said, hey, there actually these people exist. So yeah, anyway, it can be tough to convince someone what they're doing, but their bias was that they thought there was one particular best pasta sauce or whatever. But in fact, there were people who like different pasta sauces. So anyway, just kind of know that your biases can kind of form how you investigate things. So just kind of be aware of that. Cool. All right. Story time over. All right. Emphasize your points with a narrative. So this is where I like to tell people like, talking about a narrative, like talking about like as a story. So just know that like as people, we tend to like stories, both if we're technical and non-technical, just like kind of described a very brief, clumsy story that I kind of pulled up. Is that we like to have an idea of like how this process works. So even on the technical side, like you want to kind of build your narrative as if you, how do I say this? When you have your narrative, like in reality, what you probably will do is you'll load the data, you start exploring it, you go and explore in a certain direction, you try out some stuff, you're like, okay, start building some visualization. And then you realize like, wait a second, I didn't consider this thing. And you go back to explore, like, oh, let me explore this. Like, oh, wow, like I didn't even notice this was here. And you have to redo your visualizations, stuff like that. The truth is that you didn't just like pull up the data and then know exactly what to explore and then made those visualizations and came to a conclusion, right? But your narrative would be closer, like in reality, it's like, oh, you did the kind of exploration, kind of creating your visualizations, like, oh, wait, I should explore some new stuff. I did some more exploration, confirming that. It's like, okay, then you come up with your conclusions. So what you might do actually like in your like kind of your narrative of your technical is skip that extra messy details and say, hey, like these are the things I explored. And then it's like, okay, I found these things. And so I conclude this. And so the way I kind of explain this is like, you can imagine when you're exploring, you can go down these different like fractal, like rabbit holes, like going in different directions like that. But not all like directions that you explore are going to be relevant. So you don't necessarily have to like really talk about that. If you do feel it's kind of relevant, like you might include it. What I tell people is like, if you feel like it's really, really like, it's like, oh, like it's not really like relevant, but it could be interesting in other contexts. Sometimes I say to people like, make it like an aside essentially and say, hey, this might be useful to explore, but not relevant to this project itself. And then that can be something you can come back to. So that's why I talk about like building that narrative, like where the narrative is like, oh, like almost in some cases, like you might even say like, I'm going to explore this thing. Like if you ever read someone else's notebook, you'll see like, I'm going to explore this thing. Oh, look at this really interesting thing we found. How convenient. In reality, it's didn't explore that one thing. They explored like 10 other things, before they found like something that was actually relevant to what they were looking for. So know that you can kind of edit that a little bit. Does that make sense to people? Yeah. So note that the way I kind of phrase is like your notebook isn't a stream of consciousness. Like your notebook is kind of like a more coherent like story that you're telling, like how you found this exploration, stuff like that. Like hopefully that makes sense. And hopefully that's clear too. It's not like I'm saying like lie, like in your like notebook. Just kind of like basically trim things down, because otherwise you might have way too many things where it's really, it's not coherent anymore for the person reading your stuff. Okay. Does that make sense to people? Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. Use visuals to emphasize your points. So you can use explanatory visualizations, right? So your explanatory visualizations are things that you probably put for more for non-technical. It's like, hey, like here's like you can imagine like you need to do your visualization. Like this visualization should emphasize your point to whatever you're saying. So for example, you're saying, oh, romance movies are like the way to go because they make the most amount of money. Have a visualization that shows, you know, like let's say the amount, you know, movies are pulling in from the box office, and like show like, oh, romance movies, you know, comedies and all that stuff, right? Like you can kind of break it apart like that and show, oh yeah, this is what I'm talking about. This is my evidence for it. Note that I kind of say like each slide in a non-technical presentation really should contain a single idea. So emphasize what you say. So one thing that I think, depending on, and this is definitely a different style for different people, but I do think it does end up flowing a little bit better if you try to condense like like each slide containing a single thought. Sometimes what people will do is they'll say, I found X, Y, Z, and they'll put that in one slide. And sometimes it's like X, Y, Z, W, you know, Q, R, right? And like there's a lot of things on there and they're all important. But what tends to happen, at least from my experience, and you know, you guys, these are not like strict rules you have to follow, but like what I've noticed is that when you say like, oh, here's all my things that I've noticed, or here's all my recommendations, it gets kind of summarized in people's head and they forget the individuals anymore, like individual things. They kind of focus more as like, oh, recommendations, and they might remember like maybe 2 or 3 of them, you know, if you have like a list of them. So what's better, I think, is when you say, hey, this is what I found, let me tell you about X, and say, okay, and then we looked at Y, and this is what we found for Y, you know, and then maybe at the end of that, you know, like talking about each of those points, having like a summary slide, like, so therefore we say X, Y, Z, you know, QR and whatever. So the idea there's like each slide is containing its point versus like saying like all these points and then talking about it. So this is where like people depend like on their different styles. Some people's presentations, they're 5 slides and they take 30 minutes talking to us about those 5 slides. Other people, they will have like a 10-minute presentation and they have like 100 slides, you know, going through like each slide and going through. I don't think you need to be on either one of those ends of the spectrum, but know that it is a spectrum, right? Depending on like how you want to phrase things. But in general, I like to say, usually in data science, like what I've usually seen from a lot of students, they'll put a lot of things on one slide and then they'll talk about each part and each slide, which is great. But I'm like, it could be easily just a slide per idea, if that makes sense. Is that making sense to people? Okay, cool. All right, so that's kind of like my advice. I do have some more advice that we'll talk about later. I'll probably repeat some stuff, but oh, this video is not relevant anymore. Sorry. So really the main things you need to put in together is your notebook, your technical notebook, and your non-technical presentation. If you haven't written a blog yet, this could be a good one to write a blog about, is talk about this project, kind of accompanying you with this thing. But no, it's not part of the actual assessment. Okay, does that make sense to people? Cool. All right. So this is where I say like, any questions at this point? How are we feeling? Thumbs up, thumbs down, silence. All right. So hopefully this is giving you guys a little bit of like reassurance versus making you guys more nervous, hopefully. So, all right, so I'm gonna give you guys some general advice because we're at the 30, so about 30 more minutes of the study group. And then we'll get some time maybe to set up a repo. So I'm not gonna like go through everything in individual because I'll go on forever. We'll talk about this maybe in future weeks or future study groups as well. This is actually old right here, so don't worry about this. But turn in learn, turn in on Canvas. So you can actually turn it in. I'll show you guys what that looks like as we get into project week. But you want to make sure you have your stuff actually turned in before our scheduled like one-on-one assessment. So what I mean by that is next week we'll have people start like, you know, like towards the end of like project week, people can start like scheduling when we can do a one-on-one assessment. Is that make sure you have your stuff done at least like 24 hours before that assessment. So that way I can look at it and check it out versus like if you are finishing it like that day, the day of, I might even say like, I might message you like the day of your assessment, say, hey, you know, just checking in, like, you know, how are things going? Like, you ready for your assessment today? And sometimes people will say like, I'm still finishing up this one aspect of it. And what I'll tell people is like, don't worry then, like, don't try to rush it right now and try to get into the assessment. Like, let's just reschedule, right? So that way you can actually take the time to do your assessment, like do your project, and then we can do the assessment. So just make sure it's in, like, think of it more like give Victor enough time for him to look at the stuff, your stuff, so I can kind of know like, hey, looks like you're missing this thing. You might want to do this first before we do our assessment. Does that make sense? Cool. And note that there's like a little checklist of like things that you need on the project page. So like things that you can get an idea of like what I'm looking for. So your notebook. So we have a new Jupyter notebook already. We kind of know how to use that. Keep the data science lifecycle in mind. Really, in this case, we're really looking at like this first stage, like business understanding. Like, it's like, okay, like what does the business want? What does the business need? What is this business stakeholders like? Hypothetically, you talk to them and like have an idea of what's going on. You don't really have to worry about data mining unless you want to add extra information. So your main stuff really going to be is like data cleaning and exploration. So looking at the data, making sure like it's relevant, make sure it's clean enough, right? And then exploring it and figuring out what is relevant to your business problems, right? Of like saying, okay, how's this relevant to the business understanding? And then we're really skipping over these steps 5 and 6. In this case, we're not really predicting anything. We're really just kind of like do some exploration and really putting like data visualization, presentation, thinking like how do I like talk about what I've discovered and what I concluded into some final form. Make sense? Okay. Cool. All right. Okay. So some things about notebooks, like keep it nice and clean and organized. Like I mentioned this already. So like use Markdown cells. Like you guys don't want to say Markdown cells, right? In Jupyter Notebook, I'm talking about like cells like this where I can like type and write and stuff like this. The way you can create Markdown cells, for the record, you can add a new cell. This is normally like code, right? I can change it to Markdown cells right here. And then I can actually type something that looks more like text and stuff like that. So if you didn't know, now you know, hopefully. So use Markdown cells to explain what you're trying to achieve, what you're trying to investigate, kind of like that narrative. It's like, okay, like I'm gonna like your code is doing the work and you're kind of like talking out loud, essentially like the things that you were gonna say out loud, like if you were to walk someone through your notebook, that's what you'd write down in your Markdown cell. If that makes sense. So you might have something like a Markdown cell, like, oh, I'm gonna do this thing. We want to investigate what different genres there are, and then you have your data, your code that maybe looks at what the different columns are, what the different genres are, and then maybe a Markdown cell after is like, oh, so we see that most movies are the romance genre. You might do some conclusion right underneath there. That's kind of like the idea of how you can structure things. Try to use functions when they're relevant. Like this kind of helps you so you don't have to repeat yourself. If you find yourself copying and pasting code over and over again, it probably is because you need to write a function instead of copying and pasting your code. Okay. And then if you do write a function, like try to document it, right? Use comments, use doc strings, make it readable so someone looking at your code can understand what that function is doing. Document, here's a little phrase I came up with. A comment day will keep logging and debugging sessions that day. So like, if you comment what you're doing and you come back at like the next day, you won't like be like, what was I doing? You'll be like, oh, okay, I see what I was doing here because you're reading the comment. So your comment can really explain what your code is doing. So that way you don't have to like look at the code and see exactly what's going on. Like a single comment can maybe cover like a few lines of code even. So it kind of helps explain like what's going on. Okay. Let's see here. Use comments to pseudocode. This is what I kind of showed a little bit like when I was doing was it yesterday, right? With data rank, like with the web scraping. I was kind of showing a little bit how I can write comments to kind of like get an idea of what my plan of attack is. And then you can fill in those parts. So like, for example, this right here is like read in data file, drop unneeded columns, ID is improperly read, make it a string, So like things like that. It's like, okay, like you can kind of fill out and you can kind of picture right now, hopefully, what that code might look like underneath those comments. Okay, cool, sound pretty good? All right. Keep moving on. Like I said, narrative, right? So the reader of your notebook should follow your thought process from top to bottom. So that means if you gave your notebook to anyone else in this cohort, they should be able to reasonably follow along what you're doing. If it's not super clear, it probably means more documentation, maybe Markdown cells to explain what's going on. So the other thing is like, for example, sometimes people will write code or like where like they view some bigger picture item, like in a visualization, and then they explore a certain aspect. Like the problem is like if you write code like that's like, oh, let me show like all the different movies, and then you look at just like one particular movie because you're like, oh, like this one's the most common. write that in there. Say, oh, here's all the movies. You have your code. And then in Markdown Cells, like, hey, it looks like romance is the most common movie that's made. So we're going to investigate that one first. And then you start doing that code underneath. So it kind of helps make it flow a little bit easier for people to understand your thought process. Make sense? Cool. All right. And like I mentioned, the final product does not have to be exactly how you actually did it, right? You can kind of figure out like what things are relevant and are important enough to read. If you have too much information about everything you possibly done, it can be very difficult for someone else to follow what's going on. Okay. Your notebook, remember, just a data-minded person. Just think of it like a data type team member or a manager, right? Someone who's familiar with data science, but not familiar with this specific problem. So that's kind of the idea of like when you're talking to someone, it's going to be much more of a conversation. So in the assessment itself, I'm going to kind of like say, okay, this looks pretty good. Like, you know, like let's hop over here. Like, oh, I see what you're doing. Okay, let's scroll through here. Like, wait, what's going on right here? It's like, oh, could you have done this differently? That's kind of what I'll kind of do. I'll kind of play the role of someone who doesn't actually know the data set, right? It might be someone's like, oh, why do you do this? Do it this way. And you just kind of explain yourself. So it's a lot more informal. I know, I think people are usually most like nervous. Like, I mean, I think people are nervous in general, but like probably more nervous on their very first project with the technical. And then once they get like their second project, third project, they're like, oh, okay, like I kind of see how this is going. Like I already know what I'm doing. It's easy to kind of talk about it. Okay, cool. So some presentation stuff. So let's see, I just want to make sure you have enough time. Okay, so I'm not going to go through like full detail because I will like go really specific. Like I'm really like particular about presentations sometimes, but know that like anything that I talk about here, like it's not a very, very strict rule. The only strict rule probably is like time. Is that like, it's like, oh, really? Like if you go past 10 minutes, like I have to cut you off just because of time. Like if we have 17 people for 10 minutes, that's 170 minutes. It's a long time to send presentations. So really it should be about 5 minutes. But everything else, you know, you can kind of decide if you really want to follow it or not. So anyway, taking account of your time, approximately 5 minutes. Like I said, 8 minutes is kind of like in my head, like it's good, but like you might have been going too long. 10 minutes is like, whoa, like that's just too long. Note that I also sometimes have people go really, really quickly, like where they're not giving me enough like detail. Like I feel like something's missing. And usually that hangs around like when people finish around 3 minutes in or 3.5 minutes in. Usually the shortest that feels like not too short is around like 4 minutes, where people give me enough information that I feel like I understand what their problem was, you know, what their business problem and what their insights were. Okay, cool. Cool. One thing I like to emphasize is you are the subject of the presentation, not the slides. So one thing I really like to despise, and this is my personal, I hate when people have like huge amounts of text on like their presentation and stuff like that. And not for students, just like people in general. Like I'm just like, it's just like, I'm like, oh, now I'm just like reading this whole thing and I don't want to even listen to the person. And I guarantee like, this is also why I kind of fold things over, is that like, if I open up these things right here, I guarantee you guys are going to start reading this before you guys are listening to me, right? So like, that's just like, just natural. So what I tell people is like, your slides should not replace you. Your slides emphasize what you are saying. I like to say is that the reason why they hired you was not so they can read a bunch of slides. It's because they want you to talk about that stuff. So if you focus on that, I think that really helps a lot of presentations. Beware of the wall of text, right? Like one thing, the way you can fix this, I think I even put some advice in here, but like one thing you can do is like use bullet points versus like long sentences. Like don't use full sentences. Like they just take up too much room and they're just basically emphasizing what you're already saying. So that kind of, hopefully that helps. If there's something on your slide, whether it's a bullet point, whether it's a visualization, like you better talk about it, right? If there's some bullet point on there that you never mention and it's on your slide, like I'll think like, wait a second, like what is that information, right? Like you are really the emphasis of the whole presentation and your slides are just backing you up. Okay. Make sense? Cool. All right. Less is more, but make it meaningful, right? So don't give too much info, words, like words, too much info with visualization. So one classic, like I already said, like writing long sentences instead of like bullet pointed words. Like I think a bullet point, like about 4 to maybe 6 words is probably pretty good. But also too much information with a visualization. If you put too much on a visualization, it's also overwhelming in the sense of like a wall of text. Like people are going to look at the visualization, try to look around. So in a non-technical presentation, you might want to kind of slim it down, even say, okay, like let me emphasize these points, or, you know, remove some extra information so it doesn't like add too much to the overall picture, if that makes sense. It's not too cluttered. Okay. Note that if you feel like there's a lot of information, just make more slides. That's why I tell people, it's like, don't put all the stuff on one slide. You can always split up the slides and, go through. Sometimes people really like the bullet points. And one thing that most people do or find is like, basically just make 3 slides where each slide's like, oh, the first bullet point, the second slide is the first and the second bullet point, and then the third slide is the first, the second, and the third bullet point. So then they go through it and like the bullet points appear. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. All right. Consider your audience. Just kind of be aware of like who your audience, who you're talking to, right? Really ask like, is this important to your audience? Which I think it's one of those things like really obvious, but like it can help trim the fat of your presentation really quickly. Of being like, oh, is this really relevant? It's like, I found it interesting, but it's not really relevant. I've done this myself where I realize I say something and I'm like, look at this really cool thing because, this is really interesting from my end. And then I realize talking to the person, they're like, oh, this is not really that important to you or interesting. I probably should have just kept it out and like wouldn't have been that important or wouldn't have changed anything. But just make sure you have like actionable items and make sure that's really clear, like what things are. I like to say like you really should have about like 3 recommendations, like how they should proceed. If you have for each recommendation, let's say, oh, you should do this thing, this actionable, make that a separate slide. So that way it makes it really clear. It's like, this is an important thing. It's so important. I made its own slide for it. Versus like you say have like a bullet point of like do this, do this, do this. It's fine, but I think it does subtract in the sense of being like, oh, not any one of these things are important enough to be on its own. Where really it's like, oh no, this action is important that I made its own slide. So this is why I'm emphasizing this. If that makes sense. And just know that like more accurate data, more accurate data does not mean clear data. So like accurate data can be all the data points, on a scatter plot, but doesn't necessarily mean it's clear exactly what's going on. You might, for example, only highlight or only show the points that really matter. Or one compromise you can have is gray out all the points except, maybe highlight in another color certain points that are like relevant to what you're talking about. Or keep the scatter plot there and use like emphasis like, oh, look at this area right here. So I've seen people like add like circles to like, oh, look at these data points right here. Or, they'll physically, this is obviously more like in person, right? It's like, oh, like they'll use a laser pointer or a pointer around, like, look at this right here. This is what we really care about. So just kind of know, it's like, you can summarize the data, right? And still be truthful, right? And then that helps it make it more clear. Okay. All sounding pretty good. And I'm going through a whole lot and like just talking forever, but any questions at all so far? I think you guys are pretty good. Okay. All right, there's something in the chat, right? I just realized I don't have the chat in front of me. Doesn't look like it. Cool. All right. So here are my little quick presentation advice. And this is where you can take it or leave it, right? Like you don't have to do these things. I'm not going to fail you if you do these things or don't follow them. But these are things that I find that really useful. And I usually find if people follow them, they tend to have pretty good presentations. So each slide contains a single thought or process, right? For some reason, people like are really allergic to like having more slides in their presentation. Like they're like, oh no, I should only have eight slides per, like 5-minute presentation. And I'm like, that seems really arbitrary. Why? I've seen plenty of presentations do like just many more slides and it doesn't feel rushed. It just feels like, oh, they're talking about every individual thing. Ideally, the slide should introduce or summarize what you're saying. So like you might have like, 3 different actionables. I would say have a slide for each actionable, but then maybe have a summary slide at the end. It's like, and these were our actionables. That might be helpful, especially if you feel like that was the first slide you made. And remember, the slide should emphasize your point, right? So like you are saying something and the slide is backing you up. Your slide is like your yes, not your yes man, your hype man. I don't know, like the person who's like, yes, like this is what you should be paying attention to. So they're backing you up. Okay. This is again, more strict rule. I say no more than 3 bullet points per slide. You can break this rule. Don't feel like it's like you have to listen to Victor's like structure. But I say it's that really after you get a certain point of bullet points, it just becomes like a wall of text again. It's just like there's too much information in that point. Maybe it makes sense to more split them into separate slides. The way you can kind of notice this too is like we're only having a 5-minute presentation where you're going through it very quickly. In the real world, like I don't know real world, but like in the world where you're giving a presentation in front of a bunch of people, if you see someone like writing furiously, it probably means you have too much information on one slide, right? So that's the kind of way, or if like the famous one, like I'm sure you guys have seen this before. It's like you're in a presentation and someone like, clicks the next slide and people go like, no, go back, right? Because like people, well, I'd say people like writing things down, but nowadays, I don't know if you guys notice, people like will take pictures, right, with their phone and stuff like that. But same idea. If someone says like go back and stuff like that, then it's like, oh, you're going like, it's not that necessarily you're going too fast. It's that you probably have too much information on your slide that you're skipping right over into. So people are like still reading or still processing it before you move on to the next part. Okay. Some things you should like use a sentence fragment. So usually a sentence fragment is really nice because it's easy to absorb. You don't have to read every single line. If you haven't noticed yet, English is pretty redundant. So you can really say a lot without, doing a full sentence. And I don't know, maybe some person out there is really strong in their grammar. It's like, no, we need to have exact sentences. Going back into like my high school English teacher now, but like, it's like, we need to have exact sentences. Like, no, like fragments are perfectly fine. It just helps like emphasize your points. The exceptions might be like a formal definition or like quotes, right? Like if you wanted to emphasize like this full sentence or this definition. Okay. Visuals and pictures. I love this picture right here because I don't know what you're supposed to get from this. And this is not too far from like some pictures I've seen, not even just from Flatiron, like from other people, professionals that make really crazy visualizations. And I'm like, I don't even know why you're showing this to me. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to understand from this. So just kind of be aware is that a picture can be just as like complicated as like a wall of text, right? It shouldn't be too complicated. Just like, not using sentences. Don't just pick, like, don't just take a visual and not talk about it. Like this happens a lot where usually this happens when they have more than just a visualization on a slide. So I actually tell people, just put a visualization by itself on a slide, which for some reason makes some people feel really uncomfortable. I don't know, maybe because there's no words on it. So they're just like, oh man, what are people supposed to read? But like, I think it works really well if you put your visualization by itself and you talk about the visualization. What people sometimes will do is they'll put their visualization and then like bullet points, and they'll read the bullet points or kind of talk about the bullet points, but never really acknowledge the visualization. Like if I got rid of the visualization, like, and you heard someone talk about it, you would like not notice that there was supposed to be a visualization there. I would say if you have a visualization, directly reference it. Like, hey, for example, this visualization right here, this plot, we're noticing these things. Notice this right here. This is important. That's the kind of idea. Pictures are really nice. Again, can give high density of information, but too much information can be too much information, too much for us to really understand what's going on. Okay. Cool. And I realized that these two are the kind of more other advice and stuff like this. This was actually, we used to have people do a video recording beforehand. It's not a requirement anymore, but it's not a bad idea. Like, it's kind of like that. We did this partly because then people would get practice, like just like trying to do it. So I would say like, try to do like, I don't know if anyone hates, like I'm sure most people hate watching themselves on a video. I'm not a huge fan of that for myself, but it can be really helpful, like recording it and just get an idea of like, where you tripped up or what made sense and all that stuff. But don't stress out about it too. Like we're not turning anything in, so this advice kind of doesn't apply, but don't worry about that too much. But just make sure, I say, replace this video thing with like just practice, and you can practice with other people. You can practice it with friends and family, right? You can just practice it, I say in front of a mirror, but like it'd probably be easier just to practice it like on your computer, right? As if you're doing a presentation. Okay, cool. The blog, that doesn't have to be tied to your project itself, but if you do tie it with your project, I think it's a really good one. It's kind of a nice like extra thing you can add to your project and kind of emphasize. And it also helps you kind of think about your project. So when you have this project, you can talk about it to an interviewer or a hiring manager and say, hey, these are the things that, you can say like, oh, I talked about like, I found these things in the projects, or like, oh, this was a really interesting thing that I discovered while doing this project, or what I learned. You can write that in a blog, and that blog, it's kind of nice because then if you already write that stuff, it's a lot easier to remember those things when you talk about, when you go to an interview in the future. But some suggestions for a blog, if you, kind of aren't super comfortable, you don't have to be an expert writer. There's a lot of people who write blogs, especially like on medium.com. You can see them, the data science focused, that like, you don't have to be an expert, like you don't have to be an expert writer. So don't worry about that. Suggestion, focus on one technical aspect of the project. So one thing is like, the curriculum kind of mentions about like 1,000 to 3,000 words is about right. Don't feel like you have to talk about all of your project. You can talk about like one particular aspect of your project. Maybe, for example, you found it really interesting about how to make a certain visualization. You can talk about how you made this visualization for this project. You can maybe focus on saying, you know, like, I ended up like wanting to get data for like, you know, my project that wasn't included. So I actually went and used like an API, or, you know, I did some web scraping. You can actually talk about that one aspect instead of the whole project in general. Note that if you do write a blog, like, this is where I say, like, try to don't focus on being, sometimes people think of blogs like very like, you know, so this is why, like, very flowery kind of like this is what like data science is so nice and like blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, this is great. But like, what you really want your blogs, I would say, is being more technical. So you should see like a little bit of code snippets, like, oh, this is some code, for example, I used to create this visualization, you know, and talk about like why this visualization was important, or like what things you had. That's the kind of things you include. Again, I suggest like medium.com, doesn't have to be medium.com, but if you look at medium.com towards data science, you might find a lot of like really relevant things that can be what's it called, like you can get an idea of what people write out there and kind of get an idea of like what you can do. Funny story too is, like, for the record, for like Medium, like I don't know, you guys read any of the Medium articles? Like, you guys get suggestions online, stuff like that? Yeah, they're usually pretty decent. They're all really cool because it's like from other people who are writing it. It's funny, the other day I literally was like going through, I'm like, oh, this looks like a really interesting Medium article, and I was reading it through. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. I'm like, oh, I really like this. And I looked at who it was. It was one of my former students. I wrote it a few days ago. So yeah, it was kind of cool. Like, and like, they're not an expert writer. They're not someone who like went to school to like do any writing and stuff like that. You know, they didn't come from data science, but they're now graduated, and they've had to do they actually had to do 7 blogs before. So they actually had to do 7 blogs before. And this was not for an assignment. This is not from the Flatirons. It's just like, obviously they wrote this blog because it was something relevant to them. And you could see, it's like, oh, that practice of writing blogs really helped them write things. And I was like, oh, like, even if you weren't my student, I would have really enjoyed this blog post, and I found it actually really relevant. So that's kind of the idea of this practice too. And it puts your name out there. So yeah, cool. All right. Yeah, so that's a lot, right? But yeah, any questions about structure, project, or anything like that right now that come to mind? No? Okay. How are we feeling like about like kind of, I know I gave you guys a whole bunch, so how are we feeling about this project? Are we like, yeah, I can't wait to get this project going? This is like, I'm so scared, I don't want to do this. like, is it too late to quit? Hopefully no one's like this way. Sideways, like, all right, like, I'm kind of nervous, but you know, like, I know I can get this done. Like, you know, I just need some more time. How are we feeling? I only see like a couple. Okay, I see a few thumbs sideways, maybe towards the top and stuff like that.
I had a quick question.
Yeah, Safe, go ahead.
So the data that we're getting, I believe they're all zipped. So can we just put the unzipped version in that folder, or should we just have like do like the Python function for like gzip and do that?
So you're talking about like how these are .gz, these are zips, right? Compressed files. Yeah. What's cool is that if you use the pandas read CSV, which you most likely would, this does support compressed files too. Okay. So you can even pass this compressed file, assuming it's the right format, right into this guy. Note that like some of these files, for example, these are TSVs. Like, and I think there might even be a CSV in here that's a different format. You might have to specify the separator and the delimiter and stuff like that. So just kind of be aware of that. I do think one of them, if I remember this right, there was, and you'll see this right away when you try it. There was a different, I'm trying to look, see, there's so many options in read CSV. I should probably just read this here. There was something that I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. Someone will find it when they try to load it. You might have to specify the file format, like UTF-8. You might have to explicitly specify that, just so you know. So just be aware that most of this data should be loaded, but you might come across some weird errors and stuff like that. And feel free to share that on Slack too, and we can guide anyone. But yeah, you can like decompress them, just for the record, and put them in your folder. But you can just keep them compressed too, because you can read them directly. Yeah, good question. Cool. All right. So that was a lot, right? So we're kind of coming up to the end of study group right now. It's about 10 minutes left, but first of all, we'll have any more questions. Like, is there any more questions? No.
Yeah, where is the file?
Oh, where's this file? Good
Yeah.
question. So if I go to repo, so it's in the repo that we've been using before, and actually go down to projects.
The main branch?
Yeah, you can do main branch, or you can go to full time. Should be the same right now. The general advice is right here, and then the movie analysis project. In this case, you can see that I haven't loaded this specific one, this notebook, but I will upload it. But for now, just know that this is basically the same thing, just the due dates are slightly different. But I'll load this up so you guys can see it too in this branch. Okay. Cool. All right. So any other questions? No? Okay. So what we'll do now, I'll actually stop study group now and we'll go into office hours. But during office hours, I'll actually record this next section too. But we'll take a little break because we've been talking for a while. This next section in office hours, I'll show you a little bit of how to start up your GitHub repo from scratch and like building it up so you can make a GitHub repo for this project. And then if you have time, we'll have open questions too. Sound good? Cool. All right, so tell you what, I'm actually going to close this meeting and then just feel to join it up at in about like 8 minutes at the hour when we have office hours. Sound good? All right, everyone. Well, I hope to see you guys there. But if I don't see you there, I hope to see you guys, was it Friday? So, because tomorrow is Thursday. Okay. All right, everyone.